The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. Coming up on this week's episode, we've got a bit of a mid-season rankings top 10 that we like to do each year. You can definitely get on board with that. Let us know what you think of this top 10, which drivers you would have placed differently and all that sort of stuff. We'll get into that in a second. We've also got the introduction of the hybrid coming this weekend at Mid-Ohio, so we'll talk a little bit about that. We've got another McLaren driver move to talk about, another one we weren't expecting in some senses. At least it's been something that's come around in the last couple of weeks or so. But we've got Christian Lundgaard joining McLaren in place of Alexander Rossi for 2025. I should probably clarify at this point, I don't usually have to do this, but should probably clarify that the move is for next year and that Alexander Rossi has not been immediately parked from Mid-Ohio and replaced by Christian Lundgaard. Christian's going to finish the season with Ray Hall and then swap over at the end of the year. JR Hildebrand's with me. He's going to... I felt like I give you a little treat this week, JR, by giving you my top 10 and allowing you to take it to pieces strategically with your brilliant nous and intelligence and wit. So we're going to run through my top 10 drivers for the first half of the season. I'm going to ask JR some questions about it, see what he thinks. And you can definitely let us know at home. You can email podcasts@the-race.com, where you can send voice notes. If you want to be featured on the show, you can send us emails there as well. We usually get emails, but don't be scared to send us a voice note. It'd be nice to hear your voices. And yeah, let us know about if any of the drivers you're upset about. I think there's only probably 2 or 3 things in this top 10 really that anyone could be upset about. I don't think there's going to be any major surprises. So I'll run through from 10th to 1st. We've got Scott McLaughlin at number 10. My top 10 is quite similar to the points really, but we'll get into some of the nuances of it a bit later on. I've got Joseph Newgarden at 9th. Maybe a slight surprise, 8th, Pato O'Ward. I've got Felix Rosenqvist at 7th, Kyle Kirkwood at 6th, Colton Herta at 5th, Alexander Rossi at fourth, Scott Dixon at third, Will Power second, and of course Alex Palou at first. A bit like last year's rankings, either at the end of the season or at mid-season, it's pretty easy to pick out Alex Palou as your number one. So maybe we won't start there, JR, but what there on the list jumps out to you most, and where would you like to start with taking me to pieces this week?
I'm not going to take you to pieces on this, but no, I mean, I think, your list is, I have typically thought of these lists or have over the last few years more and more thought about these lists more in the context of kind of where are guys at relative to our expectations, particularly the mid-season rankings.
Yeah.
By the end of the year, you've got the complete season's worth of practices, qualifyings, races. You can kind of get a feel for where things have gone sideways for guys and do they recover from that or not. The mid-season rankings, a lot of times they're in the thick of whatever they're going through, and we haven't really been able to tell whether they're going to be resolved or not. And so I think particularly with that in mind, and then trying to add this additional layer as we have typically done, but is always inevitably hard to do at the end of the day, is separating just how big a factor does the team performance end up playing to where guys end up weekend to weekend. And that's something that I feel like oftentimes when we're done doing these lists, I wish that we somehow managed to or come up with some way to make that make that a bigger part of how we think about these rundowns, because I think that there probably are drivers who are outside the top 10 in points, maybe outside, sometimes outside the top 12 or 13 in points, that could be, were they to find themselves in a Penske car or a Ganassi car, would be finding themselves on these lists. But the reality of it is that's not how it works. And so we sort of, this is more for the listeners than anything, we sort of do our best to just factor that in. I guess I would say, McLaughlin and Newgarden, particularly given the fact that were it not for their disqualifications, they would both be inside the top 5 in points. That seems harsh, but at the same time, and McLaughlin is the pole sitter at the 500, the most important pole out of the year. Newgarden as the 500 winner in pretty dramatic fashion. That definitely did come down to the driver doing his thing. Seems harsh, but at the same time, you really look outside the key highlights from those guys over the course of the year, of which a big chunk of those key highlights for both of them was at Indy. You look beyond that, and they've each had their fair share of mishaps and mistakes and just uncharacteristic seasons, really. So I think, I'm willing to sort of go along with the two of those guys being down at the bottom of this list, partially because it's the mid-season rankings instead of the end of season rankings, but also just because I think their expectations, they have not gotten anywhere near meeting their own expectations for where they're at this year. And so in sort of the spirit of counting the fact that both of those guys do drive for Penske sort of against them in a way, I'm okay with those guys being as far down the list as they are.
So the other thing there is, I also sort of thought about them being much higher up if they hadn't have had the disqualifications. And even though I feel like they should be penalised because they played their own role in those, they would still have been behind Will Power in the championship points. So I've still counted them down based on being behind their teammate, which was a little bit of what you were trying to introduce there at the start of the show, talking about it's difficult to factor in the teams. And the only thing we can do with that is mark them against their teammates, right? And that's, everyone in IndyCar will know that's not always fair. There's certain cars in certain teams that tend to get the precedent. They have the new parts first. They have, that kind of thing. We know that goes on. So it's not always a case of it being simple as a 2-car team. Well, one driver has destroyed the other one. That means they're, 10 times a better driver. It's not always as simple as that. And that's part of the nuance that you're talking about, in the sense that it's difficult to factor in team performance. But I feel like at a team like Penske, the 3 cars are pretty much identical. And for the fact that Will's delivered in a much more consistent fashion. That was another thing that I basically marked the other two down on.
And so sort of jumping up the list from there, it's worth maybe having a look at Pato and Rossi. Pato in 8th, Rossi in 4th, just because they're teammates. I think it's also it's worth pointing out that a lot of, I think, how both of us ultimately look at sort of going from the top down, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, the drivers that we want to highlight in those roles is for the sake of celebrating the guys that have done a really good job. And so you sort of end up with, when you have Pato O'Ward, Joseph Newgarden, and Scott McLaughlin, who would normally be guys who have points in their seasons that are absolutely worth celebrating, but would normally be guys that you're celebrating their performance weekend to weekend. And if you are going to be celebrating them doing a great job by their standards, they're going to be in the top 2 or 3 in the points, basically, if that's how their seasons have gone and that's how they've performed and executed. And so sort of, part of this is maybe holding those drivers on those teams to a slightly higher standard, but I'm also totally okay with that. Like, I think that's fair, basically. And so Pato sitting in 8th, Rossi sitting in 4th. Some of that is reflective of where they're at in the championship standings. A little bit of it is also that, though, that you have Pato. He's been in this situation. He's been a guy that we sort of had the expectation. We know that he's got the tools to be a totally legitimate championship threat. So when he doesn't manage to do that in a situation that has gone unchanged, he was in an environment, he's getting paid well, he's on a long-term deal, he's in an environment that he's been in, he's familiar with, he's comfortable in, all of those things. When he's not having that kind of year that you're celebrating what the guy is going out there and doing every weekend, when he has these events here and there that still seem to be cropping up that kind of end up falling apart. It's sort of how he ends up down the order. And Rossi, on the flip side, we'll talk about Alexander more later because he's vacating this seat in this situation. But last year, a lot of the discussion around Alexander that even we had was, okay, he's in this new situation. He's kind of up against it with teammates that are more familiar with it than he is. He seemed to be on quite an ascension through the middle of the year that sort of just plateaued through the end of the season, basically. He's come in this year, and while it has not been this huge jump in performance that we've seen all of a sudden, he's the standout guy on this team. He has certainly continued to move in the right direction in terms of his performance relative to Pato. You've seen very clear consistency in his speed and results, and you've started to see that qualifying pace, get extracted with a little bit more frequency as well. So, those are two guys that I think, in terms of their real on-track performance, they're probably closer together. But given that they're kind of in these different circumstances, really within the same team, I think it stands to reason that they're as far apart. And then, for me, the only other thing that's kind of fun is you've got, Felix, Kirkwood, and Herta basically stacked in between those guys.
Yeah.
Felix unquestionably, batting high percentage this year and deserves to be at least that high up in this list. I think he's a guy that you could argue, he and Kirkwood both, as far as I'm concerned, are guys that you could argue for them being higher up in this list for a lot of the same reasons that we talked about, or that I just mentioned, in terms of the differences between Pato and Rossi. Kirkwood, it's his second year within this team, but only his third as a full-time guy in the IndyCar series. He has certainly, in my opinion, shown pace and performance and an ability to execute sort of beyond his years. We're just waiting for a few more like breakout weekends from him. But had he had one of those already this season, I think we'd be talking about him unquestionably in the same breath as Colton. Like, it has felt weekend to weekend that he's more or less been right there with Herta throughout the season, and in my opinion, like, has done at least as good of a job of not making errors, not getting bogged down by stuff, not getting too emotionally involved. And Felix, we think about Shank as a small team. They're a part of this bigger team. So we have to like factor that in and kind of keep that in mind. They've got Andretti stuff, but it has seemed more often than not that he's the one that's getting the most out of it, at least just in terms of outright pace, which has been super impressive. So, I sort of like where these three guys have ended up. And I think those three drivers are sort of interchangeable on this list, basically, in my mind, in terms of where they're at.
It's so hard when you consider the peak performance of all the drivers in the list and you're trying to position them. And the fact that Pato's 8th doesn't mean we necessarily think he's the 8th best driver in the IndyCar series generally. We're just trying to back this up against, what we've seen so far this season. And I mean, Kyle's a great example of someone who I was very close to putting higher in the list and ended up not doing it, but still still sat there thinking, feeling bad for him basically that I'd put him where I have in the list. And he's basically where he is in the championship in the order, or one spot back, I think, from where he is in the championship, because he's 5th in the championship, isn't he? And the thing that's been the kind of intangible in this that you can't always put into a top 10 is that we spent all of last year basically asking Kirkwood for this level of consistency. We even spoke to him about it on the pod, and he was, it was one of the things that he marked out himself as one of the things that he wanted to improve, because he'd spent 2 years, whether it was at Foyt in his first IndyCar year or his second season, and his first with Andretti last year, finding really strong peak levels of performance, but not being able to back that up with any sort of consistency. And I don't want to say we've seen the opposite, because it's not that we've not seen any peak performance from him, it's just that we've not seen that podium yet. And that's kind of the reason why he struggle, and you kind of wonder about whether he should be ahead of Colton, because Colton has 3 podiums, but then Colton's made a lot of mistakes. Like if you think about the 500, the Detroit, the dive bomb there, he's taken himself out of some really strong positions, and I've definitely marked him down for that in my book for the sake of potentially maybe for Kirkwood there was a podium there or a win and he didn't find it, but he also didn't throw any of those kind of results away either, which ranks very highly in my book. So I was interested with that. And the O'Ward Rossi comparison is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because Pato's been very good at times this season, but he's another one like Colton who's a lot of his poor results are his own fault, mistakes that he's made. Don't say that lightly or with any sort of joy, but he has made quite a few mistakes this year, including if we look at Rossi's results, he had a 25th at Barber, which is where the wheel fell off after the pit stop, so that wasn't his fault. And if we look at he had the 18th at Road America, which was caused by it was like a load of things going on there, but basically the wastegate failed was the ultimate sort of conclusion of what had happened there. And that was an 18th. So if you take away those, his worst finish was 10th at Long Beach, and that was when he got smashed into by Pato in the first part of the race, and still managed to finish ahead of Pato in that race. So it's difficult. Also, one of the other most difficult elements of these top 10s is trying to analyze every single race performance that every single driver that you're putting anywhere near the top 10 has done and why they finished there, and knowing. It's very easy just to look at the results and go, well, Rossi's 7th in the championship, so we'll put him 7th in the top 10. But if you take away those 2 really poor results, he's been in the top 10 at every single race this year. So, he's in a similar kind of vein of form to Kirkwood, except he's got the podium. So do you put him ahead of Colton? Does he that's one of the reasons why he's gone ahead of Colton for me, is because if you take those 2 results away, then he's had a really, really, really strong first half of the season. The thing that'll be really interesting now was that we were in the same spot this time last year when Rossi had just started to hit some kind of form. We had him on the pod at the same time as well. And, you were talking about being really excited to see what we were going to see out the second half of the season from Rossi. And it didn't kind of grow in a kind of exponential way. It kind of leveled off a little bit over the second half of the season, and some things went wrong for him. We'll take that into account. But I do feel like it would have been really exciting to see how he'd got on in the second half of this season, only now we know he's leaving the team. So you wonder, you're always going to have that question in the back of your mind as to how the second half of this season goes, whether it's McLaren, are they giving him, absolutely everything they could be? Is Rossi giving absolutely everything he can to this seat, which I presume in both cases the answers will be yes, but you still kind of have those feelings and thoughts when you know a driver's leaving a team. So that's going to be interesting second half of the season. What did you make of the top three? Would you have moved any of those around, or is there any logic for switching those guys up a little bit, or are you kind of happy with them in championship order? Because, you know, when you're doing a top 10 like this, you're always desperate to either throw someone wild into the top 10, like I was desperate to with Santino Ferrucci because of his 12th in the points so far this year, or just put the person who's not in the championship not at number one, because it just creates that little bit of talking point, doesn't it? But I think you have to sort of keep a little bit of journalistic integrity here and just go with the top three as they are. But I'm kind of intrigued if you can think of anything that would swap them around, or if there's any reason to vote for at least Power and Dixon, I guess, being swapped in any sort of way.
I guess I think, to your point, there's a lot of cases to be made for, I would say, 4th through 10th getting moved around, or certainly 4th through 8th, basically getting reorganized a little bit, because to some points that you made, whether it's even down to Felix, I think Felix, Kirkwood, Kyle, or or Colton, that, potentially any of those guys, you can kind of swap them out with. You can make a case for them getting swapped out with Rossi for 4th, basically, just on kind of the same grounds. And that again is, part of what comes into this just being a midseason thing. We haven't really seen all of this stuff play out yet. I guess just on sort of gut feeling, Scott Dixon has had some really impressive performances this year. And so on that, just some things that he's done that have really stood out in a way that, even though Will Power has been in essence just as impressive on the stat sheet, that was kind of my only thought was, I don't know, like Scott's on form. Like I think we've talked about this on the pod recently, but he's unquestionably on championship form and could do it in like pretty serious fashion. Like, there's enough races towards the end of the year here that, given that we don't have Joseph Newgarden and Scott McLaughlin like really seriously in title contention, they could work their way back towards it, but they've got a pretty good deficit to make up at this point to put themselves in. I look at those two guys more as drivers who are just going to be taking away points from the current top 3 in the championship at this stage. Like, all 3 of these guys, Alex, Will, and Scott, would have to have a couple of pretty horrendous races, or a string of horrendous races, for, I feel like, the championship picture here really substantially to change. There's just no reason that a Ganassi and Penske cars shouldn't be running up front basically every weekend for the rest of the year at this point. So you sort of factor that in, and you're looking at those five guys being the 3 Penske cars and these 2 Ganassi cars, plus the odd introduction of Marcus Armstrong, I think, into that mix, with the obvious that everybody else on this list, the Arrow McLaren guys, the Andretti guys, we haven't talked about Marcus Ericsson basically just, having an off year basically to start the year. So he's, hasn't gotten a mention in this list, I think, for kind of obvious reasons at the end of the day, given everything that's gone on for him.
Feels like 2021 all over again. I hope he's not gonna be upset with us not having him in the top 10.
At this point in the season, there's a number of drivers that could easily turn their seasons around and be inside the top 5 of this list by the end of the year, right? It's just been one of those years that has, like, a lot of things have gone wrong for a lot of drivers, and so it's been in some ways that keeps a lot of guys sort of in the hunt for finishing well inside the top 10 in points by the end of the season, but is creating some distance between the guys at the very top and any of those drivers. Basically, you've got Colton and Kirkwood. Just from a points perspective, I feel like that they, in my mind, are the ones that are Colton, probably just because it's a lot of ovals towards the end of the year, and he has tended to be better at those places than Kyle. That he could be an outlier that ends up notching results that keeps him within range of these top 3 towards the end of the season. But the point generally being here that it's hard to argue with it's very hard to argue with Alex Palou as the number one on this list. He's just been doing the things that he's tended to do that has won him a couple of championships already, and that basically made him, in essence, unbeatable as a championship contender without Scott Dixon doing like some really crazy things to maintain just, a semblance of hope basically towards the end of the year, like a little bit of a connection inside the top five. He did reel Alex back in towards the end of the season, but it was through some fairly bizarre circumstances that enabled him to really do things that he's uniquely and maybe singularly qualified to be able to do. He's shown some of that already this year in less crazy situations.
That's true.
So I guess it's worth bringing that up just to say that saving fuel is saving fuel. Like, if you're the best guy at it, then sometime like last year, it was kind of like, oh my God, this is the difference between him like winning the race by half a lap and being outside the top 10. There's still a lot of times where it's still the difference between first and fourth or something, and that's going to matter. If Scott can be creating that type of difference, and there's enough races that boil down to that kind of thing being a difference maker, then that's an ace up his sleeve that seems like he can still manage to pull out on pretty much anybody at any event. So that may be overstating it, but we've heard these things even from his own teammate from inside Ganassi, that Alex Palou is basically just like, it's just not something that I was going to be able to do, So I say all of that basically say, I think I'm good with this being the number one, the number two, and the number three. There's a case to be made for moving some of these guys around. Will is, unquestionably back on form, and he's not a Ganassi car. So, at least in this context, we can kind of compare Alex to Scott, and up to this point, Alex has certainly outscored him genuinely, and that's just kind of that. Will's sort of an outlier as just a car on a different team. We don't really know how the Penske versus Ganassi cars actually stack up. So, you just kind of play that for what it is. But I'm really excited to see how this plays out between all three of these guys, because these three drivers, even if you throw in Colton and then you kind of throw in McLaughlin and Newgarden as likely race winners through the rest of the year, whether they end up in the championship picture, they all just have really different strengths. Mm-hmm. They've got different strengths. They all have they have very few weaknesses, but the places that they're not good is kind of different. Like the ways that they can stumble are all kind of different as well. So I think just with that in mind, it's shaping up to be a really interesting second half.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
I wanted to go on. We kind of mentioned Christian Lundgaard briefly. He was another one who I wanted to briefly mention in terms of, well, in the context of the top 10, just because I feel like the only reason he's not maybe broken in there or the reason why he's not in the top 10 is he's a victim of his own success, basically. I mean, he's been so clearly ahead of the rest of the Rahal drivers this year that maybe that should have boosted him into the top 10, and it's harsh that he's not in there. I think the only reason I've not put him in there is because I feel like there's been a couple of occasions where he probably could have had a better result and has not been able to get that over the line, whether it's been his own work or the team. And there's just too many good drivers in that top 10 that I just didn't know who was going to come out. I mean, I've got Scott McLaughlin and Newgarden at the bottom of the list there, and they're both race winners in 2024. Like they can't come out of that top 10 for basically anyone that's outside of it, unfortunately, as much as I would like to have maybe thrown an outsider in there. And I think it's just important to say that Christian Lundgaard is 11th, but he's a very close 11th in the sense that, you know, he's still been able to score some really good results, and he's been, you know, pretty consistent all the way through the season. There's just been a couple of instances where he's maybe not brought home the result that he probably should have done. And in that sense, that's even seems like a ridiculous thing to say because he's already that bit ahead of the Rahal guys. So he's already bringing home some really good results. But we should mention him because he's heading to McLaren to replace Alexander Rossi in 2025. Kind of an interesting one, this. Very revealing quotes from Alexander Rossi in the kind of announcement press release saying that there wasn't an agreement between Rossi and McLaren. So into at least what we can take at face value and what we can take from Rossi's quotes, just a mutual split here where they couldn't agree on a deal to move forward, and McLaren have gone for a different driver. And Alexander Rossi says he's very confident that we'll be back on the grid next year. So kind of an interesting scenario, but I think to me, we've not seen a good McLaren this year in terms of seeing the results that you expect from them delivering the results that you just expect of McLaren and IndyCar, and of a team that is another year on from being one of the teams with all this high investment, with a lot of, you know, really clever and intelligent people behind the scenes there. I think the team will be the first to hold their hands up and say we're not where we want to be right now, and we're not performing in the way that we want to perform. So I guess some people look at it and say, you know, is this a massive upgrade for Christian Lundgaard? And I think in terms of I would say for the long-term future, it's a good move for Christian in terms of you've got to expect that McLaren are going to suss this out and continue to move forward and get better each year. I'll leave aside any jokes about drivers signing long-term deals and then not staying at the team very long. But the level of performance he's brought, I mean, he's a race winner more recently than Alexander Rossi. For me, he was, as soon as Joseph Newgarden signed his Penske deal, he was always going to be the biggest name on the free agency market and the one that triggered all of these moves. Maybe a slight surprise because he was linked to McLaren a lot earlier in the silly season, and then that kind of went quiet as it looked like Rossi was going to stay at McLaren. But obviously this has come about in the last couple of weeks where the Rossi McLaren deal, you know, wasn't moving along, wasn't coming about, wasn't going to be agreed, and they've moved for Christian Lundgaard. How do you feel about this move, Joe? Are you excited to see Lundgaard in a change of scenery? Because I do feel like even if there's questions over whether this is a good immediate move in terms of an upgrade in sort of what Lundgaard can achieve in terms of results, it does feel like maybe a bit of stagnation the last 2 years in terms of Lundgaard kind of reaching a level and struggling to kind of break through that level with the machinery that he's got behind him at the moment.
Yeah, it's just so hard to tell when you're looking at Rahal as a team, really where they're at. You know, you have Graham as sort of the benchmark there. But his performances even have really been all over the place. And there's not been a lot of, in my opinion, there's not been a lot of rhyme or reason in terms of exactly why and when they're particularly good or not, which that then sort of, you know, generally speaking, they've been better on road and street circuits than they've been on ovals. We sort of thought they'd probably have a better month of May this year after having such a bad one last year. But, you know, the reality of that is also that it's hard to get better at Indy, like when everybody's trying to get better at Indy. So it's not this thing where it's like, oh, you just go I mean, look at Penske. They went through they had their really awful year that Simona in a Penske car and Will were like struggling to make the field, whatever, like 3 years ago or something. Um, 4 years ago, I guess. But like it wasn't until this year that they actually were qualifying where you kind of expect them to. So you think about a team with those kinds of resources, with the amount of know-how that they have, with the amount of engineering support. They have their own wind tunnel program. They've got their own straight line program. They have all the tools and resources to figure out how to be better at this thing. And they desperately want to be better at this thing. And, it took them 3 or 4 years to truly resolve that, to get back to, their expected level of performance basically around that place. And so, we've had a couple of these recent scenarios where you've got, oh, well, Mike Cannon and, Penske gearbox guy go to, or Ganassi gearbox guy go to Foyt, and all of a sudden, like they flip a switch and the car's, 12, 15 grid spots higher, in one off season. The reality of it is it just doesn't happen that way easily, and so, like the amount of effort that Andretti is putting into being better in qualifying at Indy is like monumental, and they still just can't quite, do the thing that they're trying to do. So I bring all of that up basically to say that, Rahal, it's not going to be this overnight thing. In all likelihood, it's not going to be this overnight thing that they just get better at all of these places. And they sort of strike me as one of the teams that's, the big teams that are able to be really great weekend to weekend, which at this point really are just Ganassi and Penske. Like it's very rare that either of them are lost on a weekend. And it's hard to say that for almost anybody else. Like it sort of feels like every other team shows up at the track at some point and just nothing's clicking. Like none of the cars are fast. Nobody's happy. They're showing up at some places where it's like that, along the way. And the way that Penske and Ganassi are managing to not have that happen is that they've put themselves in a position where they fundamentally have correlated what they expect to happen with what then actually ends up happening when they show up to the racetrack. So you've got the driver in loop simulator, you've got all of your simulation stuff, you've got whatever the engineers are working on, you've got all the setups, you've got all these things, you've got your on-track testing, you've kind of got these things that are triangulating where you think the engineering direction of the cars should be going and what you expect to happen, what your predicted outcomes are by changing stuff or tweaking on things or whatever. The way that you show up weekend to weekend and actually are great weekend to weekend is that all of that stuff is matching up, and it gives you a more discrete understanding for like, okay, when we change this thing, this is what happens and here's why. And that's broadly applicable to all of these other scenarios because we've managed to isolate all the variables. And it just sort of feels like there was a time when that kind of wasn't a thing for anybody, that even the big teams were not good enough at doing that they wouldn't occasionally show up somewhere and just be like totally out to lunch because they were, expecting some development package they were working on to like translate, and it just doesn't. And these are not things like, they're not aerodynamic developments like it is in F1, where it's like downforce is just downforce. If it's downforce in the wind tunnel, it's downforce on track. Like there's kind of, it's more black and white in terms of performance upgrades. Whereas in IndyCar, it's this constant management of environmental variables, track variables, all of these other things that are always changing a little bit without you really knowing how much they're changing until you show up at the racetrack again the following year. And so, but as the ability for the big teams to hone in on those things has gotten better and better, and they've been, deploying their resources towards figuring those things out. It stands out a little bit more when other teams aren't able to do the same thing, and so they end up with these this much more sporadic, performance curve over the course of the year. And it just sort of feels like Rahal has been stuck somewhere in the middle of that, that it's like they have had these moments where they go do a test and they figure something out and it does translate to a bunch of tracks. And then they're, end of the year last year, they were really competitive at a bunch of the road courses at the end of the year last year, Portland, Laguna, whatever. They were great earlier this season at the Indy road course. So it's not like it's not like the peak performance doesn't exist, but it remains to be seen if they completely understand where it's coming from enough to be able to, have that be something that they can roll out week to week. And so Christian ends up just being caught in the middle of all of that. Like, it's hard to judge, still on ovals. I mean, that's kind of if we're comparing like Christian to Rossi, just kind of generally here, like, is this an upgrade? Is this an upgrade for Christian? It's probably an upgrade for Christian because at least McLaren has, it feels like it's amidst this, chaos of all these driver changes and all of this stuff that seems very suboptimal in terms of like how a team's being run. And it does make you sort of question, is this just destined to be a chaotic environment? If that's the case, then it's forever not going to be firing on all cylinders, really. But if you remove that part of the equation about McLaren and we're just to look at it more at face value and say, this is an organization that unquestionably has the intention to build up the resources to be able to do all the things that Penske and Ganassi is doing, then I think as Christian, you could sit here and say, okay, they're far enough along that path that I now have the expectation that they are going to get there, and they're going to get there pretty quickly, or they're at least getting close to that pretty quickly. And so this should be a much more consistently competitive situation for me to be in going forward. And as a driver, you're sitting there kind of looking at the oval performance component of this, which is really the main thing that you can draw out between Alexander and Christian, in my opinion, just from a on-track performance situation. They can kind of go, pound for pound, more or less on a given weekend at most other places. Maybe you'd say Christian's punched a little above his weight more frequently than it has seemed like Alexander has, but that starts getting into sort of the nitty-gritty of, well, how good really are the cars and how good is their teammate? How good are their teammates at those places and sort of whatever. That, from the outside, we can sit there and say that difference in oval experience and performance is part of what makes this swap kind of questionable in terms of just like, would you really rather have one of these guys versus the other? You obviously got an Indy 500 winner in Alexander Rossi that has shown since then a number of times that he like does very genuinely know how to run up front at these places, like that was not a fluke. That, but from Christian's perspective, he's just sitting there thinking, well, I'm just about to go get in a car that's wicked fast at all the speedways, and then I'll show you that I can do all the same stuff, which is just, remains to be seen, basically. So it's a long-winded kind of way of looking at just this total scenario here, but there fundamentally is a difference in these two teams. There is a difference in the drivers, and until we kind of see one of them plugged in the other scenario, it's a little bit hard to know like what to make of all of that.
It's true. There's not really the data set for Christian, is there, to work out how good he is on an oval? And I know that annoys him a little bit as well, in the sense that he wants to show what he can do on ovals and be, the person who can deliver those results. And I guess he also knows that people just immediately kind of think he can't drive on an oval because they look at the results and say he's not got these results on these ovals, without talking about the nuances that you mentioned about going into how good the car is on any given weekend. And I guess it's difficult for people as well, knowing, if you just think back to like how good Takuma was at Gateway for a few years there with that team, and 2 years of, well, they won the 500 and then came pretty close to Graham as well the year after. And this is not 10 years ago. Like, this is relatively recent stuff. And for the team to kind of just fall off a cliff, I think it's hard for people to compute and sort of, with the checks and balances of Christian coming into the team and then suddenly not doing well on ovals. It's like it's almost Christian's fault, which is obviously not the case. I think that there's enough data there to show that the cars have not been good on oval, i.e. Graham not making the 500, for example, last year. So it's an interesting scenario, and it's definitely going to be interesting to see how he gets on at McLaren with a car that's definitely proven on all of those places that we talked about. I want to get into Rossi a little bit next week on after we've had a little bit of time to kind of digest where he's at. Obviously, we've got those press release quotes of him saying that he's pretty close to a new deal, or at least feels like he's going to be on the grid next year. But I'll speak to him after this podcast recorded, so I want to kind of get a little bit of insight from him on what he kind of thinks about the whole situation and drill down a little bit on that more. So that'll be interesting. Right, Joe, we've got the hybrid coming in this weekend, so we should definitely outline some bits and bobs surrounding that. I don't want to go into too much detail about the unit, because I think people are going to be reading and looking at videos and all sorts of that sort of stuff and ingesting a lot of information about the actual unit itself. So we wanted to try and talk a little bit more about what to expect this weekend, how to apply some of the things that we've learned to kind of work out what's going to be going on track, try and point out some of the things that maybe haven't been talked about as much that are going to impact how the racing is and how the weekend kind of progresses. If you do want a little bit more detail than what you're going to get here, then you can head to the-race.com. There'll be a feature on there basically going through absolutely everything I can think of to do with the hybrid that might impact this weekend and how it might change the racing. So I guess just to say, the interesting part of this hybrid unit is that it's different to other ones that you may have seen in motorsport before. Most hybrids, like in Formula One and WEC, use lithium-ion batteries or batteries that store energy for a longer period of time, whereas IndyCar is using these new supercapacitors, which are charge very, very quickly and distribute that energy very quickly as well and powerfully, but they don't store lots and lots of energy. So we're talking about quick bursts here, 4 to 5 seconds to fill it up on track and 4 to 5 seconds to discharge all of that energy on track as well. So it's a little bit different to some of the hybrid units you see elsewhere, and that has lots of different impacts on how the racing might be. But it works for IndyCar because it wants this short, sharp burst of energy, which is what this hybrid will provide. I'm sure you know how a hybrid unit works, so I won't go into too much detail on that. But again, you can head to our full feature for a little bit more detail on the energy storage system, the ESS, which is where the supercapacitors are, and the MGU, the motor generator unit, which is where the energy comes from, the kinetic energy from braking or the car slowing down. That energy is then used to spin that motor generator unit to up to around 12,000 RPM. That then creates electrical energy, which is stored in the ESS. And then the MGU can take the energy back from the ESS where it's been stored and send it back to the wheels, which is where the drivers get those big boosts. So that's cool. One of the interesting areas to think about is cooling. So if you overwork this unit and you get it too hot, these supercapacitors, once they've been sort of damaged or degraded because of the repeated use and the heat, then you can't bring them back. So if you're in a race situation and you damage those supercapacitors, it's not something that can be repaired, or you just wait a little while and then they come back again. They're done. So you have to really keep the cars cool. There's a mandated cooling system. The right side pod of the car is now spec between Chevrolet and Honda, but I'm sure there's going to be little things that the teams are trying to do to keep these units cool, and the cooler you can keep them, the better chance you have of keeping them alive and using them to their maximum over the course of a race distance. That's going to be very interesting. Also, there's like a hose that goes into the car on pit lane, so that'll be mostly in practice and qualifying where this will apply, but that's an interesting area because there's not a spec cooling unit, so the teams are being tasked with developing these cooling units to use on the car. So if one of the teams is able to cool the car quicker or better on pit lane during qualifying between, say, the first group or the Fast 12 or the Fast 6, then they might have an advantage with being able to keep that unit cooler for those sessions. So that'll be very interesting to see how that works out in qualifying, especially in that part. Some other areas to look at. Obviously, we've got the car's about 30 kilos or just over 30 kilos heavier than it would have been last year. So we've got this added weight and we've got all this energy going through the rear tyres, especially because of the regeneration that's happening. So we've got harder tyres, but the they're harder, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to wear more. Now we've got all this added weight on the car and all this extra energy being sent through the tyres. So that'd be very interesting. And we've got a different weight distribution. The bell housing is where the hybrid unit is featured, so that's quite low down in the centre of the car. So that's quite nice. It's not going to be a enormous weight distribution change like the aero screen was, where that was high up and at the front of the car. But it's still going to be interesting to know if there's going to be any setup changes required for these cars at certain tracks, whether that weight distribution is going to change things, absolutely significantly, or if it's just going to be a small thing. Speaking of small things, I think at least initially the fuel saving element of this is going to be relatively small. As you see in the usage of like push to pass, that's obviously based on fuel. So if we're having a fuel saving race, then people don't use the push to pass because they need to save the fuel. But with the hybrid unit, they can use that boost. Obviously, everybody has that boost, so it kind of negates the advantage a little bit. But one area where we might see it playing an impact in terms of fuel saving is when drivers are obviously lifting off going towards the corner. They can recharge their battery and they can use the power on the exit. So you might get a driver who's leading, who's been fuel saving for a while, who is able to get a better exit out of the corner and have, there's less chance of them being passed because they've had a better exit out of the corner. But of course, the person behind will also theoretically have the same hybrid energy to use. So that might negate that a little bit. So we're talking about short, sharp bursts of energy here. We're not talking about laps and laps and laps of fuel saving through the hybrid unit. So I don't expect that to be a massive game changer, at least with the hybrid in its current format. We should also talk about a couple of other things. So the regeneration's interesting because you might wonder why we have a manual and an automatic regeneration option for the drivers. If you didn't know that, the drivers have a paddle on the steering wheel where they can initiate the regen. It's not an on-off button. It's a gradual pull of the paddle. So if they pull it halfway, that's 50%. If they pull it full all the way, that's 100%. So why would you need an automatic regen? Well, that's kind of interesting. It will be especially impactful on low grip circuits, where if you think about a driver approaching a corner, if they're on a low grip track, for example, if you then regenerate to the maximum 100%, you're putting a lot of energy through the tires. You've got more risk of locking tires up or just completely losing grip and locking up, basically. So it's a good chance for the drivers to be able, and the teams as well, to be able to set the automatic regeneration to a certain percentage. So if a driver's pulling the paddle, it's quite difficult for them to pull to 20% and then hold it there for an extended period, 4 to 5 seconds, say, for example. Probably a little bit less than that going on corner entry. But if you can switch a paddle on the steering wheel that says the car is going to generate 20% of regeneration at a certain brake pressure, then that means that the kind of variation that the driver might have on the paddle is taken out and they can automatically regen. So that'll be particularly helpful in low grip scenarios. The automatic regeneration can be distributed by drivers kind of lifting off, or it can also be triggered by a certain amount of brake pressure being put through the car, and then the regen kind of comes on. So yeah, that's an interesting one as well to watch, how drivers are going to use the manual and automatic regeneration. Brake bias will also be an interesting thing. We don't have brake by wire in IndyCar. So in WEC, you might have a driver approaching a corner, they might brake, regenerate, and then the brake bias is at the rear of the car where all of this generation, where all the energy is being generated. If then the car stops regenerating, for example, because the battery's full, then the brake bias then moves forward really quickly. But with the brake by wire system, you can tell the ECU to control that and move the brake bias. Whereas in IndyCar, everything's manual. The driver has to do it on a dial. So if they regen entering the corner and the battery suddenly fills up, then the car will just automatically stop regeneration because it can't overfill the battery. Once it's full, it's full. So you might get a situation where the brake bias is all towards the rear and the driver has set the brake bias to a certain point, but then it stops regenerating and everything moves, and the drivers won't be able to react quick enough to be able to get to the dial and turn it. So you might see some lockups in that scenario as well. So that'll be interesting to see. Just general communication between the teams will be interesting. Obviously, a lot of terms like joules and amps being used here that haven't necessarily been used in IndyCar so much before. Obviously, the communication between the engineers, the performance engineer and the strategist is going to be really interesting to see who's delivering all of that information to the driver, trying not to deliver too much information, but enough to make sure that they're using this system properly. So that'll be interesting. And another thing to watch is the fact that the car can now be started from in the car. So where previously a starter, you see like the giant rod that goes in the back of the car underneath the rear wing. And if someone stalled on track, you would have to wait for the AMR safety team to come over and restart the car, which caused long and lengthy cautions. Now we're in a situation where the car can be restarted from inside the car using this new hybrid unit. So a massive boost for IndyCar to be able to avoid stalls, or at least stalls happen and then the car's immediately refired instead of having to send someone over to refire the car. So fewer cautions in qualifying, which will be really, really good for the drivers trying to get laps in, and fewer longer cautions in the race because we're trying to get cars refired. So for me, the stalls one is a very, very big one.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I definitely, it's funny that just the fact that like the cars will be able to refire themselves on track is such like a win in this whole situation, but it definitely is. Like, you think about just how frequently that ends up totally screwing somebody's race, or or it happening to somebody screws up somebody else's race. Like the number of cautions that we will now have going from like, full course yellows just back to local yellows will be dramatic. And especially, I think it's also worth noting, like practice qualifying, those kinds of situations. I think we're going to get like 3 races into this and wonder why we didn't just prioritize onboard starters like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be making a big difference for stuff like that, just in terms of the flow of weekend sessions because of that, particularly since IndyCar goes to so many street circuits that you end up in runoffs, and it's just hard to grab the clutch. Like, you got to be able to focus on just driving the car. So grabbing a clutch paddle is just a total pain in the ass. It's worth noting, I think, just generally that the part of the strategy here with the supercapacitor is that supercapacitors build up and deploy energy very quickly compared to a lithium ion, like a more traditional battery. And so you see them less in road cars, because you never see them basically as the primary electrical storage source in a road car, because they don't have quite the energy density that like a traditional battery has. And so just in terms of building up and maintaining a lot of stored energy in the battery, they're not really like the hot setup for doing that. But in the context of what I think you'll end up seeing, what you kind of see generally in racing, but what you'll definitely end up seeing in the IndyCar is that it's just going to be constantly building up energy and deploying it, building up, deploying, building, deploying, building, deploying. Like that's going to be happening throughout a lap at every racetrack that we go to. That's kind of the way that this is going to work for IndyCar. And it's a huge weight savings over what some of the alternatives, would have been. So, when we think about the way that Honda and Chevy basically took this on as a joint project, sort of on behalf of IndyCar, basically to design and develop this hybrid system. I think the last I heard is that it's 100 or more pounds lighter than the original system that they had discussed was going to be. Part of that is just the overall design and the bell housing, and there's all of this stuff that's kind of new to make it fit better and package it and whatever. But it is a cool. It will be unique to IndyCar. Like this is a bespoke thing that only IndyCar has. The sort of whatever the hybrid, the electrical hybrid component system is bespoke to IndyCar. So this is not this is turned into something that is very much not an off the shelf thing that is being used anywhere else. And because of that, it is actually, an extremely high performing system. I mean, when we first started talking about hybridizing the IndyCar, we were talking very clearly about something that was going to make the cars slower, and that you'd probably be going to places like Indianapolis and the cars would be like much less efficient because they're hybridized, which to me was very much like, what's the point of this if we're like, it's not a, if it's an off the shelf thing, then it's also just kind of like no innovation really that's occurring here either. Like it's just felt like a lot of lip service if I'm being totally honest. Um, what this has turned into may not have a dramatic impact on like the racing and the product of IndyCar, and is it having a dramatic impact on there being more manufacturers that are getting attracted to IndyCar? It doesn't really seem like it, whatever. So it maybe doesn't have quite the upsides that maybe it was intended to. But in terms of the actual piece, just as a technical and engineering solution of this kind, it is actually really super impressive. And the folks at Honda and GM and Ilmor have done a really incredible job getting this to where it's at. You mentioned a bunch of things that we'll have to look out for. The cooling is as you said, sort of the obvious one. And I bring that up also in the context that, like I mentioned earlier, it's going to be constantly in use. Like there's no version of having this thing on the car where you're not having it constantly regenning if you're off throttle as a part of the deceleration mechanism. You'll see that even on the short oval stuff. Anywhere that you lift, the thing will be regenning. And so that's quickly building up some energy for you to then deploy, whether that's on an automatic cycle or it's a part of, kind of like the driver push to pass, more manual deployment cycle. But the only way that it doesn't just make the car slower is if you constantly are using the regen to build up energy and then are deploying that energy pretty constantly throughout the lap. Also, like if you watch, the cars that I think are actually have been the most interesting to watch. Like if you go look at, I always found this fascinating watching Fernando's pole lap in the Toyota, whatever the LMP1 car at the time, like it was pre-hypercar at Sebring. That you could watch it at Le Mans also. I just thought the Sebring lap is just fucking insane. Like it's just such a like it looks like it's in fast forward. That you can really tell watching that car go around the track, like how the system is deploying the hybrid power, because the amount in contrast to an F1 car right now, the amount of power in the total like power unit system, basically inclusive of the ICE powertrain, the distribution of power that you're getting in acceleration was much more heavily towards the towards the MGUK, basically, like towards the hybrid system as compared to the ICE system. Whereas in a Formula One car, the thing's still making a ton of power just from the engine itself. So when you saw it contrasted more heavily in that direction, you get to see this, like when the hybrid energy is being deployed, he's like bop, 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 like banging up through gears like crazy off the corner. And then it runs out, you'll see it slowly drain out the, battery deployment, and it'll totally level out. Like, the fifth and sixth gears, it's just like taken forever to pull through the top end gears. And so this will be more akin to Formula One in terms of the distribution of power between the two components. It's still, and even more so than F1, like much more heavily reliant on the internal combustion engine, obviously turbocharged internal combustion engine, to be generating kind of total power. But I bring up the Toyota example basically just to go have a look at, to kind of get a sense for like, this is a thing that's going to be going on every corner, every lap, basically in an IndyCar now. To talk about the cooling and stuff, because of the fact that it has to be doing that for the car, not just to have this sack of potatoes in the back of the thing. Like, you have to make use of the unit of the hybrid powertrain for it to be worth having. Um, that that's what's going to make it so that the cooling thing is an issue. Like, you can't really just shut it off. Like, there's not a scenario there's not where there's not like, you're not going to be at like a dramatic loss of overall performance by getting rid of it, because you're carrying the weight of it around all the time.
Yeah.
And I think to me, so that just from like a durability perspective, I think is worth keeping in mind watching these races, that it's kind of like, there's no scenario where somebody's shutting this thing off and not suddenly just, dropping like a rock through the field if they have to for some reason. And to your point, I think it's one of the things that's most interesting, that will be most interesting about it, will be to see from my perspective. And it's silly that I haven't talked to more guys about this already, but just everything you mentioned about the braking, like, you're going to have to be, if you're using it as regen on an oval, I think that'll actually be easier, because you're never like using the brakes super hard. So you're not, unless you're coming into the pits or something, which I guess will be something worth paying attention to. Like, that's what you're setting your brake bias for in a lot of situations on an oval, is like heavy braking into pit in, like, regen getting screwed up or being one thing or another in that scenario might be something that catches some guys off guard here and there. But in essence, I think you'll end up seeing the regen and different settings for regen, like, light regen versus heavy regen, basically being used just like if you had engine braking as something that was tunable, like more or less engine braking.
Yeah.
I think in some sense, it'll feel sort of similar. It's just through the rear axle. It does affect your braking, but it doesn't like dramatically affect your braking. It's something that you can just like make a bias adjustment for and then kind of leave it. On the road and street circuits, it's certainly a different whole ball of wax, and something that's easy, that I think will be easier to end up potentially in these situations where, even if the whole system is working totally correctly, like there's nothing wrong, just having this kind of unnatural mashup of regen coming just through one axle, having to set brake bias for it, potentially change. It may end up turning, and this would be the thing that I'd be interested in. And I'm sure I could get, like, makes me feel silly for not having asked this of somebody already, because it might be that like you're just going to run full regen all the time, and so you just set the brake bias once for running the thing on full regen. I mean, that has been the case oftentimes for like engine braking modes. It's just like you just run max engine braking, and so it doesn't even really end up factoring into the way that you end up driving the car. But these types of things, because they are disconnected systems, and you don't have a situation with like a brake by wire, where, because it's all electronic, that the car can kind of like learn what's going on and adjust for it on the fly in some respects for itself. And that as the driver, you're not having to manage things being halfway in between, like what you thought they were going to be and something else, or the regen cuts out at some point or whatever. It's definitely adding a very high degree of complexity to the overall systems of the car, to a car that can only accommodate so much of them, really, without it being like a whole nother layer of stuff that's going on, that just has to be accounted for. So, I guess overall, my perspective on the hybrid unit at this point is, it is, for those of us who watch IndyCar racing at like quite a zoomed in level, of going to be a really interesting thing to see just how it ends up affecting the way that drivers and teams look at the thing they're out there doing. And it does certainly add another layer of, complexity, certainly, maybe in a good way, to just the technical aspects of what's going on at the track weekend to weekend. So it's like kind of something else to be paying attention to, seeing, where people end up taking this technology, and how they end up using it. But I think in a general sense, we can also expect that overall the product is not changing that dramatically, and so, I think you can take some upside from that, which is that there's not any particular good reason to think that races that have been really good races that we've been to, in the past are, if anything, just by adding that little bit of extra weight, adding the, extra work that the tires are going to go through that you mentioned, having there be more total power. It's basically like an extra 100 horsepower if you combine the existing push to pass with the max energy deployment from the supercapacitor. That's definitely an interesting kind of dynamic to be looking out for here. And, it's definitely going to be something coming to Mid-Ohio, because Mid-Ohio is not a place, if you're just thinking strictly about places where that stuff would stand out, like the car being heavier, wearing tires out more, having more power on tap. I mean, there have been times at Mid-Ohio where I've purposefully been running the car in like in the race, been running the car in like fuel trim maps just to try to get some like cheater traction control, basically. So all of that stuff will come into play, pretty immediately here at the first track we go to, see how much it affects, the way that guys get through the weekend.
All right, there's so much more we can talk about with the hybrid unit. I think it's fair to say it's been a massive achievement, even though it's late by Chevrolet and Honda to get this over the line and get this introduced. It's, if anything, just interesting to have it introduced mid-season, even if it's not probably ideal for the series as a whole or anyone in it in terms of the teams or the drivers. But they've been working really hard to test a lot recently to get people up to speed and get all these units ready to go. So it's going to be interesting. Jero and I will be back with another episode after the Mid-Ohio race, which I'm sure will be interesting. We'll have a lot to break down, not just a normal IndyCar race, but all of the implications of the hybrid system coming in, and also I'm sure a little bit of update on silly season and what's going on there with all of these crazy moves happening and seemingly like more drivers and seats available at the moment, which is always an interesting scenario to have. So that's all for this week's episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.